Hello everybody and welcome to this session on row level securities with hierarchies. Today we're going to go through what is row level security and why it's important. We're then going to look at how RLS works and we're going to consider facts and dimensions. So if you're with us for our data modeling sessions, you can apply that knowledge here. We're also then going to look at how you actually set up row level security within Power BI Desktop, and we're going to be introducing an external tool, DAX Studio. Finally, we're going to look at how we publish from the Power BI Desktop up to the Power BI service and how we configure your row level security within the service itself. Okay, so to start with, what is RLS? Well, if you think of a scenario in which you need to send 100 files to individuals, what you will see in the past in some instances is there will be this kind of master Excel file producing 100 odd files. Okay, and this causes loads of problems and loads of issues, in particular time and effort, version control, and things like you can start using VBA, Python, whatever to kind of split out that Excel spreadsheet. And you've also got zero control over who's actually looking at these files. So if you need to give each individual their own cut of the data, there's ways to do it in the old sort of methods. However, there's much more efficient ways of doing it, and that is using row level security. So the row level security approach gets rid of all of those Excel files, replaces it with a single Power BI file, and what you see depends on your user when you log in. So when I log into my PC, I see chris.barber@altiusdata.com. When you log in, you'll see your own name, and you can use that within Power BI to determine what numbers you should see. An important thing to also point out here is although you're getting rid of all of that Excel, you can still use Analyze in Excel, for instance, and the row level security will be applied within Excel. So how does row level security work? Well, what happens if you remember any of our previous sessions is that you have these things called fact and dimensions in your standard star schema. So your fact table here on the right hand side contains all of the observations and events, and the dimension is the way in which you want to split your data. And what you can do is you can limit the dimension based on the user that's logged in, and because of this relationship it runs from the dimension table to the fact table, so the dimension being the one side, the fact being the many side. By filtering the dimension table, you automatically filter the fact table so that they can only see the data that they're authorized to see. So what are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to look at this organizational hierarchy that I'm now showing on the screen. So it's a relatively straightforward hierarchy, but it does have a few complexities. So firstly, notice that the depth of the hierarchy can be up to 4 levels, where we've got Courtney, Travis and Junie, or it can be 3 levels deep, where we've got this other level of management starting with Lona. So this is the hierarchy, and what we're going to want to do is if Almeida logs in, for instance, we want Almeida to be able to see every single individual within the organization because everybody reports into her directly or indirectly. However, if Daren logs in, what we want to happen is we want Daren only to be able to see himself and his direct reports, and everybody else in the organization is hidden. And one final example, if we think of somebody, Travis, who's a more junior member, Travis will only see himself and he won't see anybody else within the organization. So that's how we want to set up our row level security. So we're now going to pop over to the Excel and I'm going to show you what the data that we're going to be working with looks like, and then we'll import that into our Power BI model. So here is the Excel data that I have today. Notice I've stored this all within tables within Excel, and actually using tables when you're connecting to Excel is quite useful because if your table changes in size, Power BI will be pointing at the table, so it'll automatically dictate that change in size. So the first table that we're going to look at, and we've got 4 distinct tables, is the actuals and target data. So along here we've got a company ticker on the left hand side, and that just indicates which ticker, and I'm actually using FTSE 100 companies for this example. We've also got the date, which is what's commonplace in most models, and we also have employee ID, which we're going to need to filter using our row level security. And the final 2 columns, we've got types, we've got revenue and target, and finally we've got the value, just the amount. Second table we have is the company. So this provides the FTSE 100 company information. So it's got the company ticker, the full company name and the industry classification. The third table is the one that's going to be really important for today, and this contains all of our employee information. Notice it's got every single employee name. It's also got their employee ID and the ID for their manager as well. And obviously there's some sensitive information in here. So for instance, salary and bonus, we wouldn't want that to go out. And the final table is just a simple date table that we've got in our model. Okay, so let's just close this down and let's load this into our model. So I'm going to close down the Excel and I'm going to open up Power BI, which I have here, and I'm going to import the data as always using get data, and today we're going to be get data from Excel. Note, if any of you saw Chris Webb's webinar, he talks about how Excel is one of the least efficient ways of connecting to data. So I'm using Excel in this example, but usually you'd avoid connecting to Excel. You would try to connect to much more, much better sort of data source such as SQL data or CSV. So if we double click on our salaries and commission data, what we'll get up here is we'll get a list of all of our tables, and all of the tables are the ones which have the blue at the top of the table. So we can see here we've got actuals and targets, company, date and employees, and all of these are the tabs that we've got within our Excel sheet. So we're just going to bring in just the tables, and I'm just going to tick each of them individually. Great, so with all of those ticked, I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to click on transform data, and that's going to open up our query editor so we can start bringing in the data. So that's our 4 different tables now brought into our model, and we can see that the query editor has detected the right data types. So for instance, the calendar there indicates the type date, and obviously date type should be stored as a date. Employee ID is stored as a number, and obviously employee ID is a numerical number. So that all looks fine. The data type seems to be correct. I'm just going to check the others. So if we do company, date and employees, and everything looks absolutely fine. So we can now take this and we can bring it into our model. So let's go over here to close and apply and bring those 4 tables all in at once. So what Power BI is going to try and do when it brings this data in is it's going to try and dictate the relationships already. So let's go and have a look and see what it's done. So on the left hand side, we're going to pop over to our data modeling tab, and we can see our various different tables that we brought in. I'm just going to rearrange these on the screen just to make it a bit clearer to see. There we have, so we have employees, company, actuals and targets, and I'm just going to line the date is not connected up, so I'm just going to drag date to date, and there we have all of our tables and our model built. So just to point out here that this table in the middle is our fact table, and these tables surrounding it are our dimension tables that we're using today. And it's also worth pointing out that this table here, the employees one, that table is the one that's going to be filtering our actuals and targets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an additional view of our data just so we can have it a bit clearer for today's row level security session. So the way I'm going to create an additional tab is I'm just going to use this plus bar down here in the bottom and get a different view of my data model. So it's going to create that new layout. So if I click new layout and right click rename, I'm just going to call it RLS for row level security. I'm then going to drag my actuals and targets, which if you remember is the fact table, and I'm going to drag the employees table over. Okay, so now we have the employees to actuals and tables relationship. And if I just take you back to the slides and just show you that technical slide, this is the one that we're going to be using in order to filter our fact table. So very much like I explained on the slides, we've got a dimension and a fact, and we're going to be limiting the dimension table. Okay, so just before we do that, let's do a little bit of data visualization, just to have a look at our data. So I'm just going to go up to the visualization, and I'm just going to very simply use a matrix visual here on the side. I'm going to expand that out, and I'm just going to put a list of all of the employees' name on the rows, and then on the columns I'm going to put the type, so whether it's revenue or target, and I'm just going to put a value on the fields. Okay, great, and I'm just going to increase the size just by using the formatting pane down here, and I'm just going to increase the size of all of the grid. if we go down, text size. There we go, just to make that a bit bigger. So there we have it. We have the revenue and target for all of our employees. Now it's worth pointing out at this stage that actually not every employee has a revenue or an account assigned to them. So all of the senior team across the top, so the 4 senior members, don't have accounts. They are purely judged on the performance of their team in this kind of fictional example. And again, that's quite a common example that we see in real life. Okay, so now that we've got this set up, now what we're going to do is start working through and start to create the row level security. Let's go over to the employees table and have a look at it and start to actually build that out. So I'm going to look at the table view. And with the table view, I'm going to select the employees table. Great, so this is our employees table. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add an additional column here on the right hand side, which indicates true or false. So the false rows are going to be ones which aren't shown, and the true are going to be showing the data. So for example, if we wanted to look at Almeida, she's going to have true against every single individual name. Whereas, for instance, if it's Daren, he's only going to have true against himself and his direct reports that we looked at before. So we're going to add an additional column that says true or false effectively. It's not going to show up in the table itself, but it's good. That's effectively what we're going to build in our DAX Studio. OK, so mentioned DAX Studio there. Let's now go over to DAX Studio using the external tools and start to build up that security. So with external tools selected, I'm going to select DAX Studio, and that will then open up the model. And you'll see it just open up in the background. And straight away, you can hopefully see on the left-hand side here, if I just zoom in, on the left-hand side, that's all the tables that were in our model that we have brought in. Notice, however, there are 2 additional tables. There's a date template and a local date table. And those are tables, the date template is a table that appears automatically in the background every time you create a model. The local date table is because I've got a date in there and I've not marked my date table as a date table. That would get rid of that. Actually not in the instance because I don't have consistent dates, but you can get rid of those local date tables. So even though you can't see it within Power BI desktop, it's worth noting there are additional tables there being calculated in the background, and DAX Studio shows you those tables. And obviously those tables have a performance cost. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the employees table, and we're just going to have a look at all the information that's within it. So just going to type evaluate, and I'm just going to drag the employees table over. OK, so with evaluate employees, we can now see that we have the employees table that has now been returned to us within DAX Studio across the bottom here. And I just clicked on run in the top left hand corner in order to run after I wrote evaluate employees. So that's hopefully straightforward. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a true or false here on the right hand side. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable which is going to identify the current user. We're going to do that using just by typing VAR to design a variable. And the variable that we're going to be defining is going to be, I just reduce the size of that so you can see it. A variable that we're going to be defining is the current logged in. And the way I'm going to define that is by using something called user principal name. User principal name, and you always need to encase it in these brackets. So I've now got the user principal name being returned. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that to the employees table, so that we've got the name of the employee that's logged in. Okay, so the way we do that is we go return, which is what we always need to do after a variable. We always need to say what we're going to return. And I'm going to use add columns, and I'm going to add a column to the employees table to say include. And what I'm going to do at the moment, I'm just going to, for starters, just going to return the current logged in variable that I've created. OK, and I'm just going to run that query now. So what we can hopefully see is against each individual row, you've got my name showing up, Chris.Barber at Altius Data, and it's recognizing that I'm logged in. However, just for the purpose of this, I'm actually going to change this over to one of the users within our data. So rather than it being the user principal name, I'm going to change this over to Daren.Bussard@company.com. Lowercase c. And I'm going to run that. And hopefully what you can see on the right hand side is it's now got Daren against each individual row of data. And all we have to do now to identify that it is Daren logged in is we have to say current logged in equals, and we have to use the username that's here. So when Daren equals the Daren here, we'll get a true. So current logged in equals username, run that, and there we have it. We have a true for Daren, and we have a false for everybody else within the organization. Okay, so all seems relatively straightforward. However, there's this additional complexity that we're dealing with today, which is the hierarchies element. So if we go back to our organizational hierarchy and we look at Daren, because we're logged in as Daren, what we want to be able to do is we want to see not only Daren a true against Daren, but we also want to see a true against all of Daren's reports. So there should also be a true against Lois, Hertha, Taisha and Junie as well. So we now need to use something called path in order to create the relationship and figure out the reporting lines for everybody within the organization. So if we go back to our Power BI desktop file, what you'll notice, and I explained this when we looked at the Excel, is we have the employee ID and we also have the manager ID. Now, using those two fields, what we can do is we can traverse throughout the entire relationship and figure out who reports into who at every level of the organization. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is we're just going to add a new column to our data, and that new column I'm just going to call path full. So we go path full, and I'm going to use the DAX formula path, and I'm going to show the path from the employee ID to the manager's ID. And now you will see the full path, the full relationships that's traversed all the way through the relationship for each individual within the organization. So if, for instance, we look at Junie here, Junie 3249, Junie's employee ID is 3249. Junie reports into 3238, which we can see here, and it's also within the path. If we keep going up the relationship and we look at 3238, we can see 3238 is Hertha, and Hertha reports into 3233, which we can see here on the manager, and we can also see here within the path. And 3233 is Daren, and Daren reports into 3252, which is Almeida at the top of the organization. So you can see that that path contains the full list of all of the relationships that we're going to need. Another way of thinking about this is if we look at Almeida's at the top of the organization, the employee ID is 3252, which appears within every single record. So we know if we look up 3252 in any of these records, it's going to return true for Almeida. Okay, so using that full path, let's go back to our DAX Studio and let's create that true or false column. So what you'll hopefully have noticed is that DAX Studio, because it's connected to our Power BI model, has already identified and added that path full into our data. And what we're going to do now is we're going to, take a drink of water. What we're going to do now is we are going to return the true or false for Daren and all of Daren's reports. So first thing we're going to do is we're no longer going to be able to use Daren's username. We're going to have to use Daren's employee ID. So we're going to find out what Daren's employee ID is. The way we can do that is we can use something called lookup value, which works very similar to something like a VLOOKUP or an index match within Excel. So if we look up value, the column that we want to return, and it's already given that to us, so we want to return a column, and the column we want to return is going to be the employee's ID. So let's just drag the employee's ID over here. And the second element that we have to put in is the column that we're going to be searching, which is going to be the username column. And we're searching it for a value, and at the moment we're just going to keep that as Daren.Bussard@company.uk. So we're going to keep that the same and fixed for now. We will change that in the future. And I'm just going to get rid of this equals employee username at the moment just to check that that is working correctly. So if I just delete that and I go up here to the top and click run, what you'll see is we've got include 3233 is included, and that is Daren's employee ID. So we know that that has worked correctly. So now what we want to do is we want to consider whether the path full contains 3233 at any point. So you can see here 3233 obviously is included for Daren, but it's also included for all of Daren's direct reports here. And there's a very useful DAX function for this called path contains. So if we just write this out, path contains, and we choose the path, which is going to be path full, and then we use the employee that we've looked up, which is the current logged in employee, and we just run that. What we've now got is we've now got true for Daren along here, but we've also got true for all of Daren's direct reports as well. So our DAX now knows which rows of data to return. So it all looks like it's working correctly. Let's just go and test this for one other person and just see how that's working. So let's pick Lona Star and just check it's working. I'm just going to replace Daren here with Lona.star, and I'm going to run it, and Lona.star has only one person that she can see, and that's herself. If we go back to the organisational hierarchy, what we can see is Lona.star indeed doesn't have anybody reporting in. Okay, so that's all now created. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back over to our Power BI desktop, and we're going to use this security in order to set up our row level security. Use this data to set up our row level security. Here is our Power BI desktop file. I'm just going to go back up to the visualization pane up here on the left hand side. With the visualization pane, I'm just going to go to modeling, and I'm going to manage roles. So modeling and then manage roles. With manage roles, I'm going to create a new role. That role is going to be called sales. Okay, I'm just going to call it sales. Now, when I set up a role, I can choose which table I'm going to be applying the security to. We've got 4 tables within our model that we can see. Just remember, the one we're applying it to is the employees table. Okay, so selected the employees table, and I'm going to go back to my DAX Studio, and I'm just going to copy. In fact, what I'm going to do first before I copy it is I'm just going to use the format query just to format it for me. There we go. And I'm just going to copy everything except the evaluate, and I'm going to copy it over into my Power BI desktop. Okay, so all seems to be fine so far. I'm just going to space that out a little bit more. So there's a couple of changes we need to do before we do this. So the first thing we need to do is currently it's at a fixed employee username. What we don't actually want that. We want to use user principal name that I used before, and we want to close that off. So we want to use user principal name to identify the user who is logged in. The other thing is at the moment we're adding columns to the employees table. We don't actually need any of that. All we need is we need the path contains element that's going to be being applied. So if we now save that down, that has now saved our row level security. So what we can do is if we go over to data, we can now check whether this row level security has worked correctly. Okay, so how do we do this? So with our employees table selected, we're going to go home, and then we're going to go view as, and we're going to test it as each individual. So if we go view as, and sales was the name of the role I created, and I'm going to have to type other user. If I don't tick other user, it will treat me as Chris.Barber. I want to test it as somebody else. So if we test it as Daren, who we've been looking at, what you will hopefully see is that the rows in the table will reduce to only those rows that Daren can see. So Daren and the direct reports. And that seems to have filtered the table correctly. So when Daren logs in, this is all he's going to see. The important thing, though, is that if we go back to our relationship, is this hasn't just reduced this table, it has also reduced our fact table. So we've applied the row level security here, but that row level security has propagated to our fact table because of this relationship here. And we can also see that within Power BI as well. So if we go to the table here and we select our fact table of actuals and targets, what you can see down here in the bottom left hand corner is there's 1,104 rows available to Daren, okay, because I'm currently viewing the report as Daren. If I now stop viewing up here in the top right hand corner, what I will now see is there's 2,400 rows in my data. So Daren doesn't see those full 2,400 rows of data, and the row level security is working correctly. So now that we've shown that our row level security is working correctly within the Power BI desktop, what we're going to do is we're going to publish this up to the Power BI service. The way I'm going to do this is by using the home button, and then I'm going to click publish to send it up to the Power BI service. So apologies, it's not the prettiest report, but we're just looking at the principle of using row level security today. So when I go publish, it's going to ask me to save, and I'm just going to post it to this group called LBAG, the London Business Analytics Group, and I'm just going to replace the existing data I've got there. So that's now publishing it up to the LBAG site, and it said successfully we are now published from Power BI desktop up to the Power BI service. So if I go to my browser, and I'm just going to have to refresh the page, I'm within the London Business Analytics Group, and I can see the report which I've just named recording. Okay, so with this recording, what I can now do is I can now assign people to that sales group. So if I click on the three little ellipses here, and it's very difficult to see, and select security, I can now start to assign people to the group. So what I would typically do at this stage is I would type each individual. So I might type Daren, for instance, Bussard, etc. A much quicker way is to use Azure Active Directory groups. So if I've got a group of all of my salespeople in, it might be called, UK sales, for instance. I could just put one name in here, UK sales, and everybody who belongs to that group would then have the appropriate row level security applied to them. All right. One of the important things to mention is I've only got one security group at the moment. The complexity comes in when I add a second security group. So, for example, imagine that I have a human resources department, and that human resources department wants to be able to see all of the data completely unfiltered, no matter what. Well, what I can do is I can create another group which has no security applied whatsoever, enable that, call that HR, and then put all the HR personnel within that group. So how do I create a second group? Well, if we go across again to the modeling and we go manage roles, we can now create our second role. So if we go create, and if we call this one HR for human resources, and this time I'm going to apply no security whatsoever. So I'm not putting anything in, I'm not filtering any of the tables whatsoever, so that when users are assigned to this group, no filtering is taking place on the model. So if I just save that down and we go home and publish, and we publish this back up, what we'll see is we'll now have a second group within the Power BI service, and I can now assign the HR personnel to that group. Hopefully that'll publish up. Great, so it's been successful. So let's just go back to our browser. I'm just going to refresh the page and we should see both our groups up. So here we go. Now we have sales, but we also have HR as well. So what I need to do now is I need to be really careful when I'm setting up my row level security is that I'm putting people in the right groups. So my salespeople in the sales and HR in the HR. And one thing you can do once you've done this is it's very, very hidden. But if you hover over, you can again click on these three dots and you can test it as a role. So once you've assigned everybody to a role, you can then test the report and see exactly what they will be seeing within the Power BI service. So that's really useful as well. Make sure you test your role before you then distribute your report out. Okay, the final thing I wanted to cover today was looking at sensitivity labels. And sensitivity labels are relatively new to Power BI and to Office 365. So if we just go back a second, what I'm going to do is we're back looking at our data set and our report here. And what I'm going to do is look at the settings of our data set. So if we go on the three ellipses again and we click on settings, we have this thing called sensitivity labels down here. And what we can do is we can assign sensitivity to our data depending on how confidential it is. And your company can set up their own sensitivity labels and their own sensitivity criteria. So you could want to have highly restricted as one of the sensitivity labels that you wanted within your organization. And these sensitivity labels are really important because they propagate outside of Power BI. So if you set up a sensitivity label here, assign it to your data, and then the user exports it out to a Microsoft Excel file, that sensitivity label will still be applied. And it will still apply across the Power BI, across the Office products. And you can see here, if we look at the document on sensitivity labels by Microsoft, it shows that when it's exported to either Excel, PowerPoint, PDF, it automatically applies that sensitivity label for you and it keeps your data at the right level of sensitivity. So really important to point that out. Another thing you can do with dealing with data, especially when you're dealing with very sensitive data, is you can completely stop the user from exporting data from this report. So if you go File and then you go down to Options and Settings and you go Options, and then you go to Report Settings. At the moment, I've got allow users to export summarized data from the Power BI service or the Power BI report server. I can change that over to not allow them to export data at all. So if my data is very sensitive, I might not want it to go out of Power BI at all. So there we have it. That's security and row level security within hierarchies. Thank you so much for listening and hope you can join us for another future session.